Order, order. Welcome to the first public meeting of the Transport Select Committee in the new 2024 Parliament. I'd like to welcome Secretary of State Louise Haigh, Permanent Secretary Dame Bernadette Kelly, and Second Permanent Secretary Joe Shanmugalingam, and all those in the public seats and watching online. I'd like to thank the committee team for the work they've put in to support the committee, all bar me who are new to this committee, in preparing for our roles, and also for the briefing for today's meeting. So I'll kick straight off with our first question, and I will remind the Secretary of State and civil servants, do keep your answers brief. I expect that the Secretary of State will want to answer most of the questions, but I know that there are some that are probably more pertinent to the senior civil servants to answer, so thank you. Okay, so Secretary of State, what are your immediate priorities for the department? You want to move fast and fix things. So how are you going to achieve this while also ensuring quality of service?
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Chair, on your election, and congratulations to all the new members of the committee. Looking forward to working with you and being held robustly to account, I've no doubt. You're absolutely right, Chair. Our new motto in the department is to move fast and fix things, and I'm sure colleagues are absolutely sick to the back teeth of hearing me say that, but we've wasted no time in getting to work fixing our broken transport system and getting it working for the public, no matter where they live across the country. We've already laid regulations to make it easier for local authorities to take back control of their bus services after 40 years of deregulation, and we've backed this with £1 billion of investment in local bus services through the budget and keeping bus fares capped. On our railways, we immediately got round the table and brought an end to the longest industrial dispute in the railways' history, a strike which cost the taxpayer £20 million a day in lost revenue alone. Every day the railways were on strike, and we're sorting out a number of long-standing, very localised disputes across the country, which are already starting to bear fruit, particularly on LNER and Transpennine Express, where we've seen improvements in services and a reduction in cancellations, and we'll start to see improvements in Northern thanks to the facilitation of a recent rest day working agreement. We've also fired the starting gun on reform, and the public ownership bill is merrily making its way through the House of Lords. We hope to achieve royal assent on that soon. And Shadow GBR, Shadow Great British Railways, is leading the transformation on reform, delivering integration whilst we wait for legislation to be achieved. Today, I'm also pleased to announce that I've asked the Office for Rail and Road to carry out an independent review of ticket enforcement across the rail network. We've seen some egregious examples of fare prosecutions, and whilst fare evasion is totally unacceptable and will continue to pursue it, we need to be clear that where people have made genuine mistakes, they shouldn't be prosecuted. And so, as Passenger-in-Chief, I've asked the ORR to investigate that on my behalf. Elsewhere in aviation, we've committed to the Sustainable Aviation Fuel mandate and to legislation on the revenue certainty mechanism. And just last week, I established the new Aviation Accessibility Group, chaired by Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson. And finally, on our roads, I chair a new ministerial task force jointly with the Treasury to look at ways that we can tackle the increasing costs of car insurance. And I was delighted that we smashed our manifesto commitment with a £500 million through the budget in extra funding to take aim at potholes across the country. The budget also committed to taking HS2 to Euston, to the Transpennine route upgrade, upgrading the A47 and the A57. So I hope you can agree we've moved pretty fast and we're on our way to fixing things.
Yeah, you certainly have. Keeping in the relatively short term, what are your priorities and expectations for the forthcoming spending review?
So the second phase of the spending review will be mission focused, and we're clear that transport is an enabling factor and absolutely necessary in order to achieve all of our missions, not least growth. And I work very closely with the Deputy Prime Minister and MHCLG colleagues in order to in order to align our strategies, because our housing targets can absolutely not be delivered without the sufficient transport infrastructure. So we need to make sure that those priorities across government are properly aligned. I'm very pleased to sit on most of the mission boards and work across government to make sure that transport is considered fully as enabling. But, the Chancellor set out a very challenging fiscal envelope at Spending Review 1, and we've all been tasked with making sure that the money that we have available this year and next is spent as wisely as possible. That's why we've already set out plans to get on top of HS2's costs and deliver the infrastructure investment we have to the best of our ability and as targeted as possible.
Thank you. Ollie Glover, you had a question.
Yes, in the context of the fact that a lot of rail in particular has been very centralised in terms of decision making, how important do you feel further devolution of bus and rail powers will be, both specification and operation, to achieving your vision and your plans?
Yeah, thank you. It's absolutely central to our reform of public transport, and on both bus and rail we're delivering the biggest reform to public transport in more than a generation. Central to our plans for establishing Great British Railways will be a statutory role for mayors and local leaders, because we believe those decisions are best made as close to the ground as possible. So as we establish Great British Railways, we'll be looking to ensure that they are given the proper role and accountability as part of the network, whilst also ensuring that we have Great British Railways as a directing mind and they can plan an efficient network with an efficient timetable with the network available to it. And on buses, that is absolutely about giving control to local authorities and local transport authorities so that they can really efficiently plan and deliver an integrated transport network that suits their communities. For too long, we've allowed, particularly in buses, private operators to just pick and choose whatever routes they want to the disadvantage of their communities who have no control at all. So the whole behest of these reforms is about giving power and control to local areas so they can suit their communities.
Thank you. And we'll stick with buses. Alex.
Yep. So thank you, Secretary of State, for your opening remarks. And I was really pleased to see that the first form of transport you mentioned was buses. And they are obviously the most popular form of transport across the country. With that in mind, as we await the Better Buses Bill, what would you say that the long-term goals of the reforms in the Better Buses Bill are?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, because rail obviously dominates a lot of our time and a lot of the media's attention, but you're absolutely right. The most commonly used form of public transport is buses, and for me they are absolutely essential to achieving social justice, because it is the most deprived people that rely on them the most, and it is a huge lifeline for so many people. I met a woman not long ago who was moving house because her local bus service had been cut. Lots of older people rely on them disproportionately, so that's why it's such a priority for me and for the department. So the first and overarching long-term goal is to reverse the decline in passenger numbers outside London that we've experienced over the last 4 decades since deregulation, and we are basing our reforms on the evidence. Where franchising remained in London, they have steadily driven passenger numbers. Where public ownership was retained in Reading and Nottingham, their bus companies routinely compete to be the best bus operators in the country. So that's why we want to give those same powers to every area of the country, so that they can have the flexibility and the opportunity to build those networks or set up their publicly owned bus companies as they see fit. So the department, and the first thing, Bernadette always reminds me that the first thing I ever said to her when I met her was that I wanted the department to become an enabling department, to move from being a kind of permissive and allowing the right to request franchising to getting out there into the country and supporting local transport authorities and mayoral combined authorities to develop those bus networks. That's why we've moved resource out into the regions. We're resourcing up the bus centre of excellence so that we can skill up local authorities and their capability and really support them to deliver the best and most appropriate system for their community.
Thank you. Catherine.
Since 2008, I think, as you indicated, we've really seen such a decline in rural buses. I think across England and Wales, it's 52%. In the East Midlands, it's 60%. In some local authorities, it's over 80%. And certainly we saw the previous government had the national bus strategy, and the former committee had written a report that said, despite lots of positive rhetoric and some welcome action, the promised transformation has not been achieved. I wondered whether the permanent secretary might be able to assist in terms of lessons learned in terms of what has gone on wrong, but also what input you may have, Transport Secretary, in relation to the role of the department in ensuring that, I know that the regions and the local authorities are very keen to get going, but what role the department retains in ensuring that positive change.
Yeah. So the previous government obviously legislated, or a few governments ago actually, legislated on the Bus Services Act, which allowed Greater Manchester to avail themselves of the franchising model, and that is already reaping its benefits with higher than anticipated revenues and passenger numbers. And in the new year, they'll be completing the B network, which is going to be a really exciting moment for Greater Manchester. But it took Andy Burnham 6 years to bring in a single bus under public control, which was ridiculous given he'd been elected twice in that period with the explicit mandate to do so. And the lessons learned from Greater Manchester really sit behind our reforms, and the Better Buses Bill, which we will be publishing very soon, will speed up dramatically the franchising process, we hope down to as little as 2 years, streamlining the audit process, and providing that capability to authorities, removing some of the ability to block from operators so that they can franchise much quicker, more efficiently, and at much lower cost, because it costs Greater Manchester millions and millions of pounds to go through the process. So we're learning the lessons already from Greater Manchester, but I mean, Bernadette can perhaps speak to the department's role. My take certainly from opposition in the last government was that, yes, they were enthusiastic about buses and they did actually spend significant amounts of money, but they were throwing money at a broken system. The system I described, where you're allowing private operators to just pick and choose whatever commercial routes they like, with no control over that, and then local authorities having to step in to provide socially necessary services, is not fit for purpose. And that's why we're putting both reform and funding behind our bus strategy. I mean, Catherine and Baggy will know, under previous administrations in Derby, no socially necessary services were provided at all by previous local authorities, and that left entire areas and communities completely unconnected.
So I think I welcome actually the Secretary of State's recognition that I think some good progress was made, and there was actually a renewed focus, I think, on bus services. I would say over the last 5 years, historically the department has tended to be dominated somewhat by rail, and I think the refocus on the importance of bus services has happened over a period of years, but it was a different set of choices that the previous government made about how the model should work. And this government now and the Secretary of State have a fundamentally different way of approaching things. I do think we've learned a lot. I mean, obviously, changing the legislation and making it easier for authorities to franchise their buses and to do so swiftly will make a big difference. I think the department will continue to have an important role as well, though, in supporting those combined authorities and local authorities as they seek to regain control of their bus services. We know that capability and capacity is relatively thinly spread in many places. Greater Manchester is a well-resourced authority. Not all parts of the country are as well-resourced. So I think we will have a really, really important role in working with Greater Manchester and others to spread the lessons and the learning to other parts of the country so that they can do more quickly what it took even a well-resourced authority 6 years to achieve.
Which brings me to Lawrence. You have a question on that.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask about funding and bus fares specifically. Secretary of State, some welcome new funding has been announced, I think about 1.1 billion in total for bus services, but there was that significant increase in the bus fare cap. Why was the figure set at £3 specifically? Why wasn't it set at £2.20, £2.50 or a lower amount?
So I think as committee members will be aware, the £2 bus fare cap was funded up until the 31st of December this year, and the plans that we inherited and the spending plans that we inherited would have ended the bus fare cap completely. And particularly in rural areas, some bus services would have jumped up by 650%. You know, you get some bus services in rural areas that cost as much as £13-14 for a single trip. So what we were trying to do is avoid that cliff edge with a very, very tight revenue settlement that we had that we had received. So difficult choices had to be made elsewhere across the revenue settlement in order to step in and fund a new bus fare. Now, I think what's really important to note is that we have designed this in a way that means that bus fares can't rise any more than inflation. So when the £2 cap was introduced, in areas like my own in Sheffield, some fares were less than £2, but because it was designed in such a way that didn't stop any rises, they jumped up to £2 immediately, and some fares sort of artificially rose. We've designed this intervention in a way that means that they can't rise more than inflation. So I would still anticipate that urban fares are below the £3 cap, because it is a maximum cap, and it will benefit rural areas the most. The reason for it being set at that nice round figure is because operators and passengers tell us it's easiest to understand and easiest to market. But as I say, it is a maximum, it is a cap. And we were pleased to be able to negotiate with Treasury to step in and avoid that cliff edge, which would have seen a reduction in passenger numbers and services.
And you said earlier that you wanted to base your reforms on evidence. Has the department undertaken an assessment of the value for money and effectiveness of the cap policy, and if so, is it going to be published?
Yeah, so the department did prepare a monitoring and evaluation report of the £2 cap, and we'll be publishing that report shortly. What I can share with the committee was that whilst it did slightly increase passenger numbers, it found that it would be far better value for money if it was more targeted, and that was why we kept the cap at £3 in order to protect those rural services. But we're now working to see if we can find a way to deliver lower fares for young people in particular, because we believe that would be best served by protecting younger people, and that's where we can change behaviours and ensure that we're creating a new generation of well-used bus passengers.
Thank you, Chair, and I have to say good morning. I have to say it's great to be here talking about buses first off. So I think it's great to see the progress with franchising, and I think all of us agree that's part of reversing the decline, but it is only the start, I think. You know, in Edinburgh we have a publicly owned bus company. Bus fares are £2, it doesn't cost taxpayer anything. And it is growing, but a barrier to growth is the lack of funding within the council to put bus priority measures actually in place on the ground in Edinburgh. So is that a challenge here in England as well? You talked about capability and capacity. Do local authorities have the funding and the ability to deploy that? Has that been an issue?
Absolutely, and I think because we've got mayors now that have responsibility for bus services and have bus funding, but a lot of the highways responsibilities sit with local authorities. It means that's not joined up, so those have to be considered. But as well as the bus funding that was provided, we also really protected what's known as the CRSTS, the capital funding that enables mayors to put in place that kind of infrastructure and bus priority measures as well. We'll be announcing the BSIP allocations very soon, but what I was really clear when we entered government was that we were moving away from the competitive nature of funding that the previous government presided over, which allowed, frankly, politicians to pick winners and losers. As much as I would love to pick some winners and losers across the country, it's not remotely a fair way to go about things, and it did massively raise expectations in some areas who then received absolutely no funding at all. And it was very resource intensive, both for those applying for the bids and for the department in evaluating and then monitoring them. Instead, we've determined a formula that will sit behind the bus service improvement funding, and every area of the country will get its fair share. So it will be transparent, it will be fair, and it will be far simplified and remove that kind of competitive nature. And it means it's actually allocated based on need rather than preferences.
Okay, good.
Okay, I think we'll now move on to rail, and I'll ask the slightly cheeky question, which of the privately owned train operating companies will be the first to be nationalised, and when do you expect this to take place?
So the reason we have taken a two-step process in legislative terms to the rail reform is the first very simple piece of legislation that's, as I say, making its way through the House of Lords at the moment, which gives me the total legal authority to take franchises in and keep them in. The current system allows the operator of last resort to take them in as a last resort, but then requires them to keep them in a state that can be put back out to private market. That's why we passed this first piece of legislation to give us total legislative backing. We'll then go forward with a much bigger piece of legislation next year, which will reform the railways and create Great British Railways. We'll announce at royal assent which will be the first operator to be served with its 3-month notice and brought into public ownership. But we expect all services currently operated by private operators to be brought into public operation over the next 3 years. There's been 4 successful transfers into Dole. I don't really like the acronym. We're trying to find a new one. LNER, Northern, South Eastern and TransPennine Express that have taken place in recent years, and Dole is scaling up to ensure the successful transfer of the remaining 10. But I can confirm that there's 10 privately owned train operators currently contracted to the department under private ownership. 2 have expiry dates in May and July 2025, and the other 8 have core term expiry dates. The first of those expired in September of this year, and the final one expires in October 2027.
And we have the slight issue that there's at least one, if not more, Dole-run companies that is not doing very well, but also at least one privatised company that is performing well. So I guess that's the challenge for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, there's lots of different reasons why different train operating companies perform well and others don't. Obviously, the ones already in public ownership are not a great sample of the train operating companies. There's a reason they were all brought in, because they were already performing really, really poorly. LNER is doing well now as a result of us stepping in to resolve the very localised dispute, and TransPennine Express has seen its cancellation substantially reduced since coming into public ownership. But we know Northern isn't performing as well as it should. It's always a very heavily subsidised service. But as we consider the schedule of bringing the remaining 10 private operators into public ownership, will balance operational considerations as well as the benefit to the taxpayer and how they're performing.
Baggy, did you want to probe a bit more on that?
Yeah, just building on that a little bit more, if that's okay, Secretary of State. What confidence can you give the public to the benefit of bringing these rail operators into public ownership?
So we're substantially reforming and expanding the capability in both the department and Dole. The operator of which essentially will act as the owning group, the owning company, is doubling its capacity by January and then doubling it again by next December to ensure that it has sufficient people and expertise to manage the number of private operators that are coming in. The department has an entirely new directorate that oversees the public ownership transfer and a new director, and we've significantly reformed the way that we oversee that. I have weekly meetings with the department, and I have very regular meetings with Shadow GBR, which brings together the operator of last resort, the department and Network Rail to try and drive integration and improvements whilst we're still awaiting the legislation to establish Great British Railways.
Okay, Katie.
I think it's covered.
It's covered, and we are having the Rail Minister in front of us at our next public session, I think, so in a few weeks. So, Catherine.
The Transport Secretary will know how much it meant to myself and to Baggy Shanker when the enhanced Great British Railways was confirmed with its headquarters in Derby, particularly at a difficult time for train building in Derby, which is thankfully back on track. But the whole country, particularly passengers, are very keen to understand the detail. I know the Transport Secretary moves quickly, but can you say when GBR will be fully operational and when legislation will be introduced? And if I can follow up on that a bit further, could you also talk about about how the department has taken on board the views of industry stakeholders in the drafting of the bill? And you've already spoken a little bit about the role of Shadow GBR, but can you talk about how it will relate to and work with the already formed transition team?
Yeah, great, thank you. So we will be going out to consultation very shortly on the Railways Bill, which we are hoping to introduce next summer. That will be the much more substantive piece of legislation. And if we can just pause on this for a moment, because I don't want anybody to underestimate the scale of the reform challenge that we are undertaking. I have always been clear that public ownership and simply bringing the operators under the current operator of last resort is not a silver bullet. We have to massively reduce and simplify the mass of regulation that has been built up over the last 30 years of privatisation and frankly stifles a huge amount of innovation and progress currently in the railways. In setting up Great British Railways, we have to establish an entirely new organisation that crucially has to have a completely new culture and a new approach that does not underpin any organisation that works across the railways at the moment. And that's one of the things I've tasked the chair of Shadow Great British Railways, Laura Schoaf, to really consider and think about how we establish that new culture. Because the problem we have in the railways at the moment is we have dozens and dozens of competing and conflicting interests. You've got 14 different operating companies, Network Rail. And if I can give an example, when a train is delayed, rather than work together to see how we can fix it and make sure it doesn't happen again, instead you have dozens and dozens of lawyers that argue over whose fault the delay was and how to attribute the blame and who pays for the fault. So that's the thinking behind setting up a directing mind, is to make sure that they can plan the network efficiently, plan a timetable, and just work single-mindedly in the interests of passengers. So there's a lot of work to do as we do that whole system reform. And as I say, we hope to introduce the legislation next summer. At the earliest, we'd anticipate that Great British Railways could be operational by the end of 2026. And as I say, the final operator, if they don't default on their contract any sooner, will come in October 2027. Shadow Great British Railways is designed to try and drive improvements in integration, as I say, whilst we are waiting for legislation. So it's simply a partnership of the department, the operator of last resort and Network Rail to try and identify where we can deliver integration improvements in the interim. So, for example, where both TransPennine Express and Network Rail have their own station funding pots for the same station, can we not remove that duplication and deliver savings to the taxpayer? where two operating companies are already in public ownership, for example, TransPennine Express and Northern, can we not ensure that their tickets can be accepted on each other's services when they are in disruption? So they are identifying both the backroom benefits of integration, but also passenger improvements that we can deliver, as I say, because we didn't want to sit back and rest on our laurels simply whilst we were legislating. And I think this has been the biggest challenge I've tried to bring to the department, that we are all responsible for the real world outcomes, not simply outputs. And I keep on joking that I'm not joking, actually, I'm being deadly serious, the performance stats and our outcomes plastered on the walls of the department, so that we are all taking responsibility for the actual experience of passengers, both on rail and bus, in the real world.
Can I just add a point of emphasis, really, and to what the Secretary of State has said? This is an enormous programme of change that is envisaged, and it's not just setting up GBR, it's changing the entire system of how our railways are run and governed and regulated. So obviously new Passenger Services Authority alongside GBR, different role for the regulator, very different role for the department. So it is a really, really big and complex transformation programme, probably I think one of the most significant in government that is being undertaken. So whilst I'm absolutely with the Secretary of State on wanting to move fast and fix things, I'm also acutely conscious that we have to get this right in the setup of all of these new institutions and this whole new system. It is complicated, but getting it right is critical, and it will take some time. So I can understand absolutely the enthusiasm that you have for seeing GBR fully operational in Derby, making the railways run better for the nation, and this will happen. But as I say, there's a great deal that we need to get right along the way.
We've got a few more questions on GBR. I'll get to Catherine first.
Just in follow-up, in terms of how do we ensure that freight is not forgotten when it's not a part of GBR, and spend a lot of time talking to rail companies and providers, and there is a real concern about skills and workforce. How will that feature within Great British Railways work, and how will work be done across department with other departments looking at skills?
Yeah, both really important questions. So we've been clear that Great British Railways will have a statutory duty to promote freight, and will be consulting on really stretching targets to encourage freight onto the railway. And when we talk about passengers, we mean passengers in the broadest sense, and we absolutely consider freight to be a passenger of Great British Railways. They will obviously remain completely in private ownership, but there will be that statutory requirement on Great British Railways. As for skills, you're absolutely right, and just like in a number of other industries at the moment, the railways has an ageing workforce that will present challenges over the coming years. It's part of the reason why so many parts of the railways are still overly reliant on rest day working agreements, because they're not staffed up sufficiently to cover their services. And we're faced with completely outdated terms and conditions across the railway and workforce practices that are not fit to deliver a modern and efficient railway. So that is being addressed both in the short term and the long term. But the opportunity that Great British Railways presents is a whole railways workforce strategy, which has obviously never been the case, and we can look across the railways, not just in the operational delivery but the supply chain more widely, which I know is very important to Derby, to think about what skills are needed. And we'll absolutely we work in lockstep with the Department for Education and the new Skills England to make sure that we are addressing those needs both through there and the industrial strategy, because rail and its supply chain are absolutely crucial to a modern industrial strategy.
Lawrence, did you want to pick up on there?
Thank you. The Labour Party's Getting Britain Moving document published in April said that Great British Railways would operate without the micromanagement of the current system or of British Rail. But there is that long history of central departments interfering, late scope changes, annualised budget setting. So how will you achieve that laudable aim in practice?
Yeah, it's again It's again why we're taking this kind of two-track approach to the reforms, and why I've got Laura Shoaf as Chair of Shadow Great British Railways sitting separately and very much outside the department to think about how we establish that culture, completely independent, both culturally and operationally, from government, and why we're thinking very carefully about the regulatory setup around it, because it will be regulated primarily by the Office for Rail and Road, who will look at their safety, efficiency and performance, but we'll also then have the Passenger Standards Authority that will ensure that it is really, really focused on delivering for passenger outcomes. But I've been very, very clear with the department that our role will be to hold them to account, and that's why I'm the passenger in chief and not the fat controller. As we go through the consultation period, where we will engage extensively with industry stakeholders, we will ensure that operational independence is absolutely sacrosanct, because, as you say, it's not just dominated the last few years, particularly post-COVID. It was prevalent through British Rail as well, and we need to make sure that this is neither British Rail 2.0 nor continues or embeds some of the poor practices we've seen over the last few years.
Would you say that ambition is shared across government, including in those other departments which may take an interest, including the Treasury?
We were really pleased through the budget negotiations to negotiate a risk-sharing agreement with the Treasury, which means for the first time in a long time,
since pre-COVID, I think,
that we have merged some cost and revenue decisions in the department. It means we can take those decisions based on spending in order to try and generate revenue for the railways, whereas before all cost decisions sat with the department and all revenue decisions sat with the Treasury, which is not a sensible way to run any organisation. So we're pleased to see the Treasury absolutely back these reforms, and I think the reason we've been able to move as fast as we have in these reforms is because we did a lot of thinking about this in opposition. You mentioned the Get Britain Moving paper that we did, and that was all done in a very cross-departmental in opposition way to ensure that we had the consensus across government and could get cracking on these as quickly as possible, because it is an enormous reform programme. It will take a lot of cooperation and support from across government, and we want to see it done as properly but as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go to Rebecca. You had a question.
Well, I've actually got two, if I
may.
Yeah,
no, that's fine.
One's shorter than the other, so I'll do the short one first. Obviously, this is the biggest transformation of the railways we've seen. How long do you anticipate that taking, particularly in terms of what the public are going to see? So, are we going to see change in the next 5 years? Is this going to take another 30 years, like we've seen over the last since privatisation? So, I'd just be really interested in the kind of timescale you're expecting.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's why we didn't want to sit back and wait for Great British Railways to be set up, and why I asked Laura Shoaf, who was Chief Executive of the West Midlands Combined Authority and has a lot of experience in delivering tangible outcomes for passengers across the West Midlands. So she is, really, really focused on delivering that in the interim. So we're already seeing the kind of green shoots of what integration and what this reform can achieve. On LNER, we're now down to near zero of driver-related cancellations. TransPennine Express has reduced cancellations significantly, and we've seen improvements in the Northern service because we facilitated the rest day working agreement. But we are hoping to see improvements in actual passenger benefits. So things like, as I say, the automatic acceptance of TPE and Northern tickets during disruption, which under the previous system wasn't possible because they were all competing operators. And we'll be publishing, as I announced to the House on Monday, we'll be moving to be really transparent with the public and publishing performance data at stations so that the public can hold us to account as well. But the benefits of integration, none of it will happen overnight, but we will hope to gradually, see these improvements, and the overall aim is to bring down these record cancellations and delays that we experienced over the last 4 years and deliver a much simpler, less fragmented railways that delivers a better service for passengers and, crucially, for the taxpayer as well.
Your other question?
So how much of the previous government's work on rail reform, which had got as far as publishing a draft bill, are you able to repurpose, or are you starting from scratch?
Yeah, we took a lot from what the previous government did, and indeed the review that Keith Williams conducted for a previous Secretary of State. And when we launched our plans in opposition, we were really pleased to garner the support of Keith Williams for those reforms as well, because we had learned a lot of lessons and we agreed on a huge amount. You know, Grant Shapps in his forward talked about how franchising had failed and that it had created this very fragmented and complex system that wasn't working in anybody's interests effectively. So, you know, we have been very pragmatic in taking a lot of that learning, but then going that little bit further in bringing operators under Great British Railways. And I'm really grateful in particular to the work of the transition team that you mentioned, Catherine, that currently sits in Network Rail. They've done a huge amount of work on whole industry financial modelling, on the branding of Great British Railways, on fares and ticketing reform. We'll absolutely be continuing with that capability and that work as we look to establish Great British Railways.
Okay, Scott, you've got a question,
yep.
And then Katie.
Thank you, Chair. You've already touched on the great job Ellen Yar's doing connecting Edinburgh and London, but sitting alongside them have Lumo, open access operator, who's really targeting people who are currently flying. So this is obviously a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reform the railways, but where do open access operators fit into this?
Yeah, and I think that's, it's a good example of where we've not been, where we're basing this on evidence and we're not being ideological, because I'm very happy for open access to play a full role in the future of the railways. Lumo has done a really good job in, as you say, encouraging people onto the railways and off airplanes. They're providing a very reasonable service between London and Edinburgh and providing that competition with LNER. So where open access isn't abstracting revenue from the service, and whether it fits crucially, because parts of the network are really constrained and at capacity already, which is again part of the reason why we need Great British Railways to be able to plan the network based on the actual capacity rather than just operators bidding in for slots. They need to do it as efficiently as possible, but really, really happy for operators like Lumo or Grand Central to play a full role because they are delivering improvements for passengers.
Okay, thank you. And Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, you've talked in both this rail discussion that we're having and also in the bus discussion about the kind of size and significance of your planned reforms. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about international comparators, whether there are systems elsewhere in the world that you see, either other countries that have also successfully carried out this kind of reform, or systems that you might like to emulate, or negatively that we could learn from to avoid doing the same sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the department obviously carries out extensive analysis routinely on international systems, and whilst it's difficult to always compare sort of like for like, we have looked to other systems to learn from, particularly their regulatory environment, because the work that we're doing to reform the regulation of the railways is the biggest part of this reform, and getting that right at this stage is really important. So we've looked to how our European neighbours do it. I think the biggest piece of work that we've taken is in developing our integrated national transport strategy, and I think where other countries are really successful in delivering public transport that works, it is because, to your point, Ollie, earlier, local areas have the powers, the control and the funding to really build those integrated transport networks at a local level. And this country has been very centralised for too long. And that's why at the heart of all our plans, both for public service reform And as we develop our integrated transport strategy, we are looking to deliver the powers, the control and the funding to as local a level as possible so that they can really join up their transport services. We talk a lot at the moment in the department about Dijon, where I visited in opposition, but officials have now been out to see, and they have created an incredible integrated transport system there that not just integrates their public transport systems, but also micromobility. The company that runs their system runs the parking spaces so they can dynamically price based on levels of air pollution or how they want to encourage behaviour. And they also, the same company that runs the system has stretching targets on encouraging people to walk as well. So it is truly integrated across every mode of transport, and it's that kind of inspiration and thinking that we're taking into the department at the moment.
Thank you. And Secretary of State, really interesting answers, but could you try and compress them a bit, because we do want to get onto all of the width and breadth of your department. Did you want to ask a quick question on freight?
Yes, just a quick follow-up, although first of all, I hope, Chair, you've noted the strong recommendation that we should go to Dijon for a select committee visit.
Great wine and mustard.
Just in terms of rail freight, how do you feel the balance is at the moment in this country between passenger services and rail freight? And are there any risks from GBR's close alignment between infrastructure operations and train operations in terms of creating that space for freight, given it is open access and private sector?
Yeah, I understand that freight often feels very much like the second-rate partner on the network, and there has to be that negotiation that at the moment is extraordinarily inefficient between operators, both of passenger services and freight operators, bidding in for slots. I think, as I said, Great British Railways offers the opportunity to plan much more efficiently, and providing that statutory requirement to consider freight, as well as really stretching targets, will ensure that not only are they providing the slots for freight, but making the investment decisions that will open up freight opportunities across the country, because there are a number of investment in infrastructure decisions that are relatively small in railway terms that have been held back for some time because there hasn't been sufficient attention to freight.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're now going to move on to infrastructure, and I'll let Baggy Shanker lead off.
Thank you, Chair. So another area I'm sure, Secretary of State, you've had lots of meetings and discussions on is around HS2. So what's the government's latest strategy on value for money if the line doesn't proceed further north than Handsaker?
I can start. So the last value for money assessment that we did in the department that I did as accounting officer on HS2 was linked to the decision last October of the previous government to cancel phases 2A and 2B. And I can set out that letter is available. It was sent to this previous committee and the PAC. At that point, the assessment we made was that the value for money of continuing with phase 1 had a BCR between 1.1 and 1.8. But my letter also acknowledged that that assessment is done according to Green Book methodology at a point in time. It included sunk costs, for example. If you look at the totality of phase 1, as it is now envisaged, and based on our estimates then of costs and benefits, then it does not represent high value for money. It is costing more than the benefits that ultimately phase 1 alone can deliver. So that was the assessment we did then. We haven't done an assessment since. I haven't done an assessment since. We are still working through, and I'm sure we can say more about this, and the Secretary of State will want to say more about this. We are now working through exactly what phase 1 and completing delivery of that is going to cost. We're also working through exactly what the benefits of phase 1 will be based on its this government's plans for scope, etc. And at that point, I would expect there will be a full business case, and I would expect to do another value for money assessment. But there isn't one that has that is updated since the decision last October.
And are there any timings around that? Sort of?
Well, there's quite a bit of work to do, I think, to reach a conclusion on exactly what we now think phase 1 is going to cost. There are some very difficult and complex issues that we are seeking to resolve. There are issues around scope, of course. Government's just announced plans to tunnel to Euston, so that's significant decision. We need to work through in the spending review exactly what the profile of spend on phase 1 is going to be, and that will have an impact on its total cost as well. And there are a number of other issues we see of a more kind of technical nature that we're seeking to work through with the company to ensure that we have really reliable cost estimates and therefore a sort of outturn range that we can rely upon. That work is going to take some time. And won't be complete, I think, before the spending review. So that's the sort of time frame, but as I say, I don't want to give an exact deadline. There's a lot of work to do. It's really important that Mark Wilde, as well, the new CEO, who's due to join, is able to properly own and lead that work, and we want to allow him the time to work with us to resolve some of those issues. But I feel I'm now straying into the Secretary of State's territory.
Just to say specifically on that, it's, the arrival of Mark Wilde is really important to the organisation. The HS2 has been without a proper CEO for over a year, which is not good enough when you consider the scale of the organisation and the money, the public money that it is spending. So Mark Wilde arriving will be really important. But on entering government, we immediately took steps to reinstate the cross-ministerial task force that hadn't been in place immediately prior to oversee the delivery and the cost control of HS2, because I was really struck that there hadn't been much government political oversight of the cost control of HS2, and it had frankly got out of control to the point where, as Bernadette's just said, we don't yet know how much phase 1 will cost. Now that's partly due to the fact that we've just announced new scope in confirming the delivery of the tunnelling to Euston, but I also asked James Stewart to instigate a governance review, and he'll be providing interim findings of that next month to look at HS2 Limited itself and whether that can be delivered in a much more effective and efficient way.
Okay, Alex, you've got a question.
Thank you. So as you've just mentioned, the Chancellor recently announced that public money would ensure the construction of the tunnels bringing HS2 to Euston, and that's welcome. Passengers who currently use Euston Station know that, quite frankly, it's rather grotty. So I'm sure that they, and indeed new passengers, will be keen to know how the government is expecting to finance the construction of the new Euston terminus and the wider redevelopment of that area.
Yeah, thank you. So there's 3 stations that will need work at Euston. There's the conventional network rail station that needs, as you say, a little bit of redevelopment, the new HS2 station and the underground station. And under the previous government, there were several attempts to try and bring that work together, none of which the proposals were affordable. We're working with Camden and the GLA through the Potential Development Corporation to look at how we can leverage private finance into the new HS2 Euston station. The conventional station will be publicly funded. And you may be aware that we've already taken steps, and that's actually another good example of where integration between Network Rail and train operating companies has already delivered improvements. Euston had become famous for the so-called Euston Dash, where platform announcements were made far too close to train departures. Network Rail and the train operating companies now have an integrated station management plan to avoid that happening. Passengers are moving around the station much more freely, and the large advertising screens have been temporarily turned off, which were agitating passengers unduly.
That's fine in the immediate terms, but can we be assured that the final solution for Euston stations, the 3 stations, will be big enough with adequate passenger circulation capacity and platforms to actually serve the rest of the 21st century?
Absolutely, and that's the challenge that a number of iterations in the previous government have gone through, and that's why we need to set up the right delivery model that takes responsibility and can be held accountable for both capacity, for the track and for getting passengers out and into London, but also in the station itself. We are looking, creatively at private financing options, but the tunnelling to Euston, as the Chancellor announced that the budget, is publicly funded, which we're really pleased.
And can I just add, the history of the HS2 station at Euston has been a difficult one, to say the least, as I'm sure the committee knows, but I do think one of the opportunities that now exists is to look at Euston in a much more integrated way, to look at the high-speed station, the conventional station and the underground station as a whole, and think about what is needed to meet that future demand.
Thank you. Rebecca, you had a follow-up question.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State again. Obviously linked to the HS2 development is the impact on Old Oak Common and changes to journey times from the southwest start this weekend. The Rail Minister heard quite strongly earlier this week that hasn't been communicated with enough passengers in the southwest, but that's an aside. What thinking has been done to mitigate the impact on those lines that are essentially paying the price for an enhanced railway service for the north of the country to facilitate HS2? Under the previous government, train journeys from Plymouth have got as low as 3 hours, and that's going to become a thing of the past for people in the southwest. And what is being done? Are there any sweeteners you're going to be able to offer? The Tavistock to Plymouth line was promised by the last government, directly paid for by HS2 funding. I realise there's arguments over that money, but what's likely to happen, and how do you envisage reassuring people in the rest of the country that they're not going to be paying the price for HS2?
Yeah, thank you. I spoke to the Rail Minister after your meeting. He was suitably affected by your collective concerns, and has, as I'm sure he communicated, agreed to go away and consider with Network Rail how we can minimise that disruption, because we're very conscious that over a very long period of time that services will be disrupted to the southwest. So Lord Peter Hendy will be considering if that can be minimised at all. On the Tavistock line in particular, as you'll know, it was included in the Restoring Your Railway programme, so that means the Restoring Your Railway funding stream has been cancelled, but not the individual programmes in it, and that will be considered as part of the internal capital review that I'm undertaking ahead of the spending review. I think, for every part of the country, we'll be considering infrastructure, capital, and local spending as we go up to the second phase of the spending review. But the South West will absolutely benefit both from the significant uplift in highways maintenance funding, from the bus service improvement funding, and from the wider uplift in local bus services as well. But we're very conscious of the particular disruption that Old Oak Common will cause to the southwest, and as I say, the Rail Minister, I'm sure, will be back in touch very quickly to determine how we can minimise it.
Thank you. Catherine.
When you became Transport Secretary, you said that transforming infrastructure, promoting social mobility and tackling regional inequality were strategic objectives, and I think in this room you're likely to find many who agree that investment in transport infrastructure is key to the government's growth mission. But as you've just indicated, that due to kind of the financial inheritance, difficult decisions have been made in relation to the Restoring Your Railways Fund and Network North projects. What more can you say about the progress that has been made in reviewing those projects? How can you ensure that infrastructure, particularly rail infrastructure, plays its part in the industrial strategy? And are you satisfied that the Department has the right tools to appraise the full benefits of potential capital projects?
Thank you. I'm really pleased that you linked that to appraisal, because that's at the heart of our infrastructure strategy as we look towards the second phase of the spending review. When we entered government, there was £2.9 billion worth of unfunded transport projects in the Department for Transport, and a significant number of those were in the Restoring Your Railways programme. There were massively raised expectations by the previous government around funding commitments, both through the cancellation of HS2, but through various funding streams such as restoring your railways. And what we wanted to do is resist calls to commit to very specific pieces of infrastructure and campaigns around specific stations or lines, but take some time to develop an infrastructure strategy that serves this government's strategic priorities, which are promoting growth but tackling regional inequality and driving median incomes. That's why the department are undertaking a significant piece of work to reform our transport appraisal guidance and ensure that it properly considers socio-economic outcomes, because at the moment it doesn't recognise that £1 is worth more to those on lower incomes than those on higher. So as per the Treasury Green Book, actually, we want to make sure that our appraisal guidance properly values costs and benefits to people on different incomes. We're also moving to more a vision-led approach to planning, which will allow much more multimodal design of schemes from the beginning and ensure that we're tackling a problem in the most efficient and most progressive way, and capturing the transformational benefits of infrastructure as well. I think that's where appraisal in the past has failed to deliver the most accurate benefit cost ratio or value for money assessment, because it hasn't properly captured the jobs growth and housing benefits in particular that transport can provide. So we're looking to do this in a much more strategic way than perhaps the previous government undertook. And that's why it's taking a little bit more time as we look towards the infrastructure strategy in the spring and the second phase of the spending review.
Right, Ollie, you had a follow-on from that.
Yes, we've already touched a bit on benchmarking and international comparisons and some of the challenges around those. Nevertheless, many studies and benchmarking shows that UK transport infrastructure costs, particularly for high-speed rail and trams, you mentioned Dijon. Britain Remade did a good study comparing Dijon and Birmingham tram extensions. Those costs are grossly disproportionate to a lot of comparators. What are your plans to understand the reasons for that and to tackle the root causes?
Yeah, it's as you say. I mean, it's brought to light so clearly with HS2, which is a particularly egregious example. But it's true of all major infrastructure projects in this country. And in opposition, I commissioned Jürgen Mayer, who is now the chair of GB Energy, to conduct a review into exactly why this is the case. And part of the reason was political, which is the stop-start and rescoping and reprofiling of projects time and time again, which we sought to avoid in the budget, and which is why we were really delighted that the Chancellor confirmed funding for major schemes such as the Transpennine route upgrade in East-West Rail. But a massive part of the reason is planning, and that's why the Deputy Prime Minister is taking forward a significant piece of legislation in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and we have worked very closely with her on that through reforms to the Transport and Works Act, but other wider pieces of infrastructure legislation that will allow the speeding up of planning, but also allow some concurrent planning processes to go ahead, which will reduce time and cost of major infrastructure.
Can I add a couple of things as well? I mean, I completely agree. Politics and planning are definitely two of the sort of endemic challenges that we've faced in terms of the cost of delivering infrastructure over the past years. I think there are other things too. I mean, the nature of our geography and sort of what we're building on is a major factor as well. You know, the fact that we're often building off Victorian infrastructure creates complexities. We are a relatively smaller country than some, and we tend to build in city centres. That adds cost as well. I think there are also some quite more technocratic things that we need to work on. We have a underperforming supply chain, and we need to think about how we can drive the productivity and efficiency of our supply chain in constructing new infrastructure or improving the infrastructure we have. And I think if we're being honest, and I think it's really important within the department, we're completely honest in addressing the things that are within our control and not just looking at the things that feel as if they're not. I do think there are things that we need to learn and are learning about how we set things up for delivery effectively, about how we build organisations to have the right capability and competence to deliver infrastructure efficiently, and how we ensure in the department that we are genuinely building the capability that we have as well. We've done a lot of reflection already on the lessons from HS2. James Stewart's work, the independent review that the Secretary of State has commissioned, is going to, I think, provide some very important further insights as well in how we can ensure that we don't repeat some of the challenges and that we are delivering infrastructure more efficiently and more effectively. So I think, there's a lot here. I could talk at great length. The committee doesn't want me to do that, but there is a lot for us to learn and a lot for us to improve.
Catherine, you wanted to come in on something that Dame Bernadette's just said.
Yes, if I could. I mean, you mentioned the stop, start and boom and bust massively contributes to cost when you don't have that steady pipeline of work, whether it's the supply chain or other infrastructure projects. What is being done to try and ensure we do have that steady pipeline, which is a real way of bringing down cost?
So I think there's two parts of that. There's both infrastructure and obviously as a Derby MP there's the approach to rolling stock as well and the wider supply chain, and the department is working to establish a long-term strategy on rolling stock to flatten out those orders across the industry. And again, Great British Railways offers the opportunity for us to do that in a coordinated and efficient way, because the industry has been characterised by feast and famine over the years, which has led to enormous job losses time and time again, and then staffing up in periods of over orders, which we need to avoid. In terms of the long-term pipeline of infrastructure, both on road and rail, that will be informed by the 10-year infrastructure strategy that is being led by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and will work across DCIT, DESNES, MHCLG, myself and DBT to join up transport, industrial strategy, energy strategy, housing, and ensure that they are all properly supportive of each other, because we're all completely symbiotic. And I think, for the first time, there will be a very ambitious long-term national infrastructure strategy.
And I would also add, we're working very closely with colleagues in the Treasury and Cabinet Office on the establishment of NISTA, which we hope will be an important institution, both in helping the government to develop its long-term pipeline for infrastructure, and providing the evidence base and the assessments, just as the NIC does at the moment, but also in building capability, both in government and in our delivery partners, to then build the infrastructure efficiently.
Can I pick up on a point that Secretary of State mentioned about the appraisal of transport schemes? It's something that frustrated the Transport Committee in the previous Parliament, an inquiry that I was on, and a couple of new members have mentioned that to me, that the getting a business person in their car to shave 10 minutes off their drive time is seen as a benefit, whereas others are not. Do you feel that the department has the sufficient tools to fundamentally revise the way we appraise the benefits of transport projects?
Shall I start? And then we have a new chief analyst who brings a significant amount of expertise and passion for this area, which is fantastic. And I'm working closely with him and his team to ensure, as I say, that our appraisal properly reflects socioeconomic outcomes, health outcomes, and the transformational benefits of transport. But I think my reflection, and I'm sure Bernadette will add to this, is that the appraisal does currently assess a huge number of different inputs. And I think as politicians, we should avoid being overly reliant on that appraisal, because ultimately our decisions are political and we can use the appraisal that's in front of us in whatever way we want. And what I have found is that if I ask the team to provide me with projects that highlight or bring to the fore different outcomes, then they are absolutely capable of doing that. So if it is a political choice to reflect tackling regional inequality or socioeconomic outcomes, the appraisal guidance absolutely it will after this round of reforms allow us to do that.
Yeah, I find myself slightly defending transport appraisal guidance quite often in front of select committees. It is actually much more complicated in the department than we're often given credit for. The caricature that it's all about the economic bang for buck or whatever is I think, overstated, and it is more sophisticated than that, and we do constantly work to refine it. That said, I do think there are some significant areas for improvement, and Jo is actually leading our work on that at official level, so may wish to say more about the detail. But I think the Secretary of State's point about political choices is critical here. It has never been the case that what happens is that we stack up all the BCRs of all the potential projects or investments and then top slice the ones at the top. Politicians have always made choices and can always make choices. And of course, one of the things that we've built in strongly now to our value for money assessment, and my role as an accounting officer is ensuring that we are looking not just at the business case in narrow terms, but at the strategic case for investment and how that is aligned to the objectives of the government. So, it is more flexible, I think, and more sophisticated than is often understood.
And the only thing I'd add is it's not only what the appraisal guidance says itself, but it's how it's used. Because already today, it's not just us using the appraisal guidance, it's local transport authorities right away across the country. And as we move to being a department that's enabling those local leaders to make these decisions more, it's how we support planners and local transport authorities to see the opportunities, to see how the appraisal guidance can help those political leaders and those decision makers make the judgments. Because often the sort of tools are there, but then it goes back to the capacity and capability, and it's, in a complicated set of guidance, it's easy to revert to the thing that you've done before. And so we have a responsibility to help all local transport authorities understand, the future tools, flexibilities, different insights the appraisal guidance will enable decision makers to use.
That's helpful. So now moving on to another crucial part of our transport infrastructure, and ones that is in all MPs' email inboxes. Scott.
Potholes. So I was really pleased you mentioned them in your introduction, but I'm sure as you go around the country you must be ashamed of the state of the roads. And we have to remember as well, when we talk about potholes, it's also about footpaths and the barrier poor footpath condition can be. So realistically, over a 5-year term, what kind of impact do you think we can make, particularly given the state of local government funding?
Yeah, during the general election campaign, when we managed to get the financial commitment over the line on potholes, the Health Secretary dubbed me the pothole princess, which I'll take. It is a really significant commitment in this budget to 25-26, and as I say, well beyond actually where our manifesto commitment left us to fix and repair up to 1 million potholes per year. That is just for 25-26, and the ambition for the second phase of the spending review is for similarly ambitious levels of funding, but crucially over multi-year funding settlements. The current annualised settlement for local authorities means that they can't do the prevention work and the planning that is so patently required to fix the crumbling state of our local roads, and we know that prevention work is so much more efficient than the patching up of repairs. And as annoying as potholes are, I know how even more annoying it is for residents to see people come around and patch it up and then have to come around and do it again in just a few months or even weeks' time. So being able to provide that multi-year settlement at the spending review will be absolutely crucial. But what we're trying to work through now as we get to 25-26 is a way to ensure that funding is absolutely directed and spent on highway maintenance, because there is obviously a risk and a balance with devolution that money goes out the door that is intended for potholes and road maintenance but gets dragged into other areas. So we're just trying to find the most light touch way that we can ensure accountability around that funding to make sure it goes where it's intended.
It's probably worth mentioning as well, the NAO published a report on this a few months ago, and indeed I'm appearing before the PAC to answer questions on it next week on local, the condition of our local roads. Money is undoubtedly really, really important, both confidence in future funding streams and quantum now. There are other things that I think that report highlights that we can and should be thinking about in the department. One is ensuring that there is a really good understanding of the condition of our roads, and we did publish a new road condition data standard quite recently. And then I think it's about, obviously local roads maintenance is for local authorities, but the question is how can we best support them in identifying best practice in the efficient maintenance of their roads as well. And so I think we need to think about how we support the activity and the responsibilities that local authorities have there.
So really sorry for being a pedant there, Bernadette. We talk about roads, you're also talking about footpaths. So I do get there's issue with roads, but we are talking about footpaths as well. Yes, okay,
yeah,
thank
understood.
you.
Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah. And for those watching who want to delve deeper into this subject, tomorrow week, Thursday morning, I'm guesting as in Public Accounts Committee session, which is all about the condition of local roads. Yeah. So that session will go into this in depth. So we'll see you there. Thank you, Scott. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk about motorways as well. As you know, drivers' journey times are going up. There was something which went very badly wrong with the Smart Motorways programme, and the predecessor committee to this committee said that National Highways had overpromised and underdelivered in the last road investment strategy, and the regulator has just found that there was a breach as well of a National Highways licence. So what's your assessment and what's the department's assessment of what has gone wrong with road infrastructure delivery, and what are you doing to fix it?
Well, I think Bernadette can perhaps speak to lessons learned from RIS2, but my understanding, certainly from the National Audit Office report and in holding the government to account from opposition, was that again it was overly ambitious and over-programmed with very ambitious new road schemes. And I think predecessors to this select committee and other stakeholders will have there is a consensus out there that the focus should be much more on maintenance rather than upgrades and new schemes. And I think those are the primary lessons going into the third road investment strategy as we look to publish that in the new year. I think going back to Ollie's point earlier about the delivery of infrastructure as well, our planning reforms elsewhere will reduce the cost and the time of delivering schemes that plagued RIS2. But those are absolutely the lessons that we're taking into RIS3 as we look to publish in the new year.
Just a couple of additional points. So RIS3 will be quite different, we expect, than RIS2. I think when this was looked at by the NAO, they identified quite a lot of delays in delivering on particularly the new schemes, the new road enhancements. And a lot of those delays were linked to difficulties in getting DCO approvals and then addressing and sort of seeing through what can be a very long tail of legal challenge. And we have learned a lot of lessons on all of that, certainly National Highways in terms of its DCO applications process, and also, of course, the government is looking more widely at how we deal with accelerating the planning system and legal challenge within that. So I would hope and expect that we won't see a repeat of some of those challenges in RIS3. I think the other thing to be conscious of is National Highways increasingly is also an organisation that isn't just about sort of civil engineering, it's about technology and operating the roads really, really efficiently, and that's an increasingly critical part of its role on the National Road Network. And I did have the data, and I do now have the data. They are now meeting performance requirements. So, obviously the challenges that we've seen before on stock vehicle detection and things of that sort are things that National Highways are taking very seriously. They have KPIs and they're working with us to ensure that they are achieving the KPIs that we set for them.
Okay, I was going to ask about RIS3, but it's been answered, so thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you. So we're now going to move on to greener transport, starting with Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. The new government has published a paper in Getting Britain Moving, contained a commitment to setting targets for modal shift as part of helping to lower emissions from the transport sector. When do you anticipate those targets being introduced?
So that modal shift ambition and targets were, as you say, included in our Getting Britain Moving paper, which was which was addressing rail reform. So they're much more about carrot rather than stick, and making sure that rail is an attractive proposition for people to move onto, and also for freight, as we discussed earlier. So setting a very stretching target for Great British Railways to have on freight, and encouraging the shift. We'll set out those targets as we look to legislate for Great British Railways ahead of its operational introduction.
Do you have any early thinking about what type of targets they're likely to be? What approach to the target setting you're likely to take?
I think we need, full consultation with industry, in particular over the freight target. The previous government had an increase in 75% by 2030, I think it was, in its freight targets. Thank you. We'd want to be more stretching than that, but we need to make sure it's achievable and absolutely in line with our infrastructure investments, as we discussed earlier as well. And in terms of passengers, I think, again, that would need to be done in consultation with local leaders and our devolved authorities and settlements as well, to make sure that they are as ambitious but achievable as possible.
And I guess more generally, we're working with colleagues on the next carbon budget delivery plan, which will take us through to the end of carbon budget 6 in 2037, and that will come out next year.
How do you feel the decision to freeze fuel duty whilst raising the bus fare price cap and above inflation rail fare rises aligns with the department's commitment to greener transport?
I mean, I understand from a pure transport policy perspective why there would be people that would make the case for increasing fuel duty in order to encourage people out of their cars. But I think in the current context, it represents a significant cost of living issue for so many of our constituents. And my take is that in too many parts of the country at the moment, there aren't the alternatives for lots of people. If you're a care worker operating in shifts and having to get around any environment, whether it be a city or in a rural area, you are absolutely reliant on your car. If you live in a lot of rural areas, you are reliant on your car if you're fortunate enough to have one. So I know that was a lot of the thinking behind the Chancellor's decision to freeze fuel duty, because it just represents such a massive cost of living pressure. I did really welcome the announcement to increase passenger duty so significantly on private jets as one of the most significant polluters per passenger. And our ambition is absolutely to make public transport more affordable, but crucially more reliable. And that is absolutely my overriding objective, because it's reliability that keeps people off buses and bus services as the single biggest obstacle at the moment.
I'm very glad you mentioned aviation, because I have a question on that. But just one more, Chair, if you'll indulge me. I totally understand what you're saying, Secretary of State, about the importance of cars. But also, some of the people on the very lowest incomes don't have a car at all, and they will be bearing those bus fare increases. So I hope that is something that is being taken into consideration.
Absolutely, and as I said earlier, we wouldn't expect all fares to rise to the full £3 because they will be capped in line with inflation. So we would hope that those people who are most reliant on buses don't see significant increases in their bus fares. But look, the £1 billion of public money that is going into bus services is absolutely to increase those services and that reliability. In too many parts of the country that I've visited, they don't have a bus service that starts before 9 a.m. and will finish before 5 p.m. They are not fit for purpose, which is the overriding objective behind our reforms and the way our funding is targeted to increase services, improve reliability, and encourage more people, help more people on bus. But I absolutely agree that those most deprived are most reliant on public transport.
On aviation, so when we had a visit to the department earlier in the week, I was very interested to hear about your plans for decarbonising aviation. The 2023 Royal Society study in relation to sustainable aviation fuel estimated that to meet just the UK aviation fuel demand, more than 50% of agricultural land would need to be dedicated to biofuels, or at least 2.5 times UK annual renewables generation to produce synthetic fuels and the various other ideas that are out there. Do you believe that sustainable aviation fuels are realistic, or do they run contrary to the law of physics as a way of decarbonising aviation?
So we absolutely think sustainable aviation fuel is going to be an important part of the mix. It's certainly not the sole answer to aviation decarbonisation, but we are confident that the industry can meet the mandate that we have set that will be introduced on the 1st of January of next year at a level of 2%. Rising over subsequent years. But there are plenty of technologies that are being developed by other airlines and by other members of the aerospace industry. EasyJet, for example, are investing heavily and looking very carefully into hydrogen. But we did have under the last government the first transatlantic flight on sustainable aviation fuel, proving that the technology is safe and capable. I think one of the most interesting things about that flight, though, was that a significant amount of carbon savings achieved through it was because it flew in a straight line between the UK and the US, and that is absolutely behind our plans to modernise airspace. And we're out to consultation at the moment on the UK air design space system, which will allow us to reorganise airspace much more efficiently. I was talking to one short-haul provider the other day who said their flight between the UK and Spain uses 22% more fuel than is required. So it's adding unnecessary costs onto the cost of air travel, but also those carbon emissions are completely wasteful. If we could just design the airspace more efficiently, then that would be a big part of modernisation as well. But Jo, I don't know whether you want to say more on
just on the choices of fuels. You'll know that in the SAF mandate, the government's set a cap on HEFA, the hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, which reduces over time, but also set an obligation on power to liquid to encourage future generations of technology to exactly enable and ensure we have those supplies, and also why we're supporting through the Advanced Fuels Fund the development of those advanced technologies and the legislation to come forward on the revenue certainty mechanism to ensure we get the investment behind the real commercialisation of those technologies, which is a real strength for us here in the UK.
I could ask so many more questions, but I've had the mic.
Okay, Rebecca, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. This is potentially a bit granular, but it's something that keeps coming up, and it's something that has sat with me for a number of years because I've done a lot of work in planning in the past. Electric vehicles, obviously, we want to encourage as many people as possible to use them, but I don't know what colleagues found, but over the election period in particular, most of the houses that had an electric vehicle were detached. They've clearly got somewhere to charge it. They're clearly retired, got some spare cash to be able to facilitate that. What I then get on the other end is people who live in terraced houses saying, how do I charge my car? And I have to go back to them and say, my particular local authority doesn't have a policy on how they want to facilitate charging from a home across a pavement or whatever. What are you able to do to work with potentially MHCLG to push them to enhance the planning system, to push local authorities to actually crack on and get a policy, and not just to rely on on-street parking, because on-street charging, because I think that isn't always going to be the entire solution. How do we help people in our poorer communities that are terraced homes to charge those cars if they aspire to buy one?
It's not a granular question at all. It's really important, and access to charging is obviously one of the biggest barriers, at least in perception, if not in, as you've described, in reality, for people making the transition to electric vehicles. We're about to pass, we already have passed the milestone of over 70,000 publicly available EV charging devices in the UK, but I am very conscious that there is regional inequality of where those charging devices are. Obviously, significant numbers in London compared to the rest of the country. So we are pushing forward with the Levi Fund, which will support local government to provide public charging infrastructure. And again, that sort of shift to the department being more enabling will provide local authorities with the support and the capacity to be able to apply for those funding and then navigate the complicated current planning system to be able to charge them. And then for wider planning reform, we are already working with MHCLG and have agreed a number of reforms in there that will accelerate public charging points, and working with DESNES, making sure that EV charging points and wider decarbonisation is higher up the grid prioritisation, because obviously grid capacity is a massive barrier here. I don't know, Jo, whether you have any other things.
Yeah, so two things. First of all, the Levi Fund, the criteria for the allocation of funding to local authorities takes into account a number of factors like deprivation, the number of charge points today, rurality, to make sure we best use that funding. And also, and again, goes to the future role of the department, we're providing revenue funding to local authorities with that to make sure they can have the capacity and develop the plan to the right infrastructure for their local area. And then we also consulted earlier this year on amendments to the permitted development rights, exactly to support householder and business electric vehicle charging points, and we will respond to that consultation shortly.
Okay. Catherine, you had a supplementary on that.
Just building on that, what work is being done to look at the differential on-street charging costs and motorway charging costs? Because it's one thing if you're able to always charge from home, but if you're looking at charging elsewhere, there seems to be huge variability on the costs of that.
Yeah, I mean, charging at home is can be as low as under 3p per mile now, so it is an extraordinary saving on in comparison to petrol or diesel vehicles. But the last government actually introduced the public charge point regulations, which will start to improve consistency and standardisation. We are looking at ways to provide more transparency across pricing and oversee the massive differentials, but we will start to see improvements in the consistency of the quality. Anybody that has an EV and has attempted to charge in public will have found that lots of charge points are broken or don't accept contactless. We're working to ensure that there is proper consistency across there, but as I say, we're also providing oversight on the transparency and the differentials in pricing.
Okay, and finally on this section, you briefly referred to vision-led planning, and in terms of modal shift away from dependence on the private car, how new developments and the new housing developments that is very much part of the government's vision are going to be a key mechanism there. So, I mean, the national planning policy framework is crucial. And how is your department working, and how are you working with colleagues in HCLG to ensure that vision is a core aspect of new housing developments?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are and have fed into the new version of the MPPF to ensure that both active travel and public transport are fully considered when new developments are taking place. And Active Travel England is already a statutory consultee to new planning. The vision-led approach is very much led by my department, and what it's trying to break down is the current state of affairs where you have a specific sponsor, be it Network Rail or National Highways, rather than look at the challenge and then decide from a multimodal perspective how you're going to meet that challenge. So it's much more it's much more looking back from the scale of the issue and then trying to design the most appropriate mechanism. I think going back to, I mentioned earlier, the integrated transport strategy as well, what that's trying to break down is the very traditional approach to transport policy in this country, which has been infrastructure led, and we're trying to work back from people and be much more behavioural based, so that kind of thread is running through a number of pieces of work from the department at the moment.
Well, we're now moving on to integrated
very
transport policy. So, Katie.
So on that note, actually, it would be great to understand, you've mentioned it now in a couple of instances, but what the main aims of the strategy will be, and then a couple of things around timeline, both when you're looking to publish the strategy and the period of time that the strategy will cover.
Yeah, so again, it goes back to the point I made earlier about Dijon and about other areas, European countries in particular, that appear to have managed to build much more effective integrated transport systems at a local and regional level. And I think part of the reason we've struggled to do that in this country is because we're too centralised and we don't have those powers and funding streams at a local level. But also because we've taken quite, as I say, an infrastructure-first approach, and I'm very struck by that now as the Secretary of State. You know, every time I step foot in this building, I'm lobbied by colleagues about specific stations or specific roads, and I don't think the department or the industry has taken enough interest in the past in actually how people want to move around and how people behave. So the strategy is an opportunity for us to sit back and take behavioural science and take the quantitative and qualitative data that is available to us across the country and ensure that we have the right controls, power and funding at a local and regional level to build these systems that work for people. And that, as I said earlier, will encompass all forms of transport, not just public transport, but micromobility, e-scooters, e-bikes, ensuring that we're encouraging active travel as well. I'll be setting out my sort of overarching vision for that soon, and then we're hoping to publish the strategy in full next summer.
And do you have a sense of how long it will cover, or will it not sort of work like that?
As in what time frame it will cover? Or...
Yes.
So I think it will. How I'm envisaging it will be a sort of quite living document. It will set out where we want to get to in terms of devolution and the kind of controls and best practice guidance that exists around the country, but also around the world, that then local transport and regional transport authorities can learn from. So it will, it won't cover a specific time frame, but set out that kind of best practice guidance and the tools available that we want to make available.
Haigh, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just a question around, the UK being a leading, plays a leading role in aerospace and aviation, and linking that with the industrial strategy. How do we sort of invest but protect manufacturing jobs? We've spoke about decarbonisation, and just maintain that sort of leader in the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Derby recently at Rolls-Royce, seeing the fantastic work that they do there. But obviously, they're experiencing difficulties in their supply chain at the moment, which is having a knock-on effect on the aviation industry and indeed aviation services more widely. Working with colleagues in the Department for Business and Trade to develop aerospace as part of their overarching industrial strategy, and that's one of their key priorities for working both in skills and ensuring that we've got the investment in manufacturing, because we have world-class manufacturing in this country and we don't just want to preserve it, we want to grow it because we have an enormous amount of expertise in advanced manufacturing. I'm really proud that Boeing had its first factory in Europe in South Yorkshire and are developing state-of-the-art wing technology there that will contribute to airspace decarbonisation as well. So it's a really crucial part, particularly in those areas of the country that suffered deindustrialisation in the 80s, that we want to make sure that we've got that investment, those jobs and those skills there, and as I say, working really closely with DBT to ensure that we preserve and grow it.
Thank you. Rebecca?
This is active travel now, isn't it? I've got 16 on my list. Sorry.
Yep. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
So we've switched to active travel now.
Yeah. It's integrated.
Yes, it is integrated. Sorry, my fault.
Sorry.
You previously stated that the government would invest unprecedented levels of funding into active travel. So when do you anticipate this unprecedented funding being allocated? And I suppose a supplementary question is how. For example, will there be a focus on plugging the gaps that exist at the moment where funding has come in chunks and often part of a cycle path can be created but not the rest of it? I'd be interested in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that kind of thing you've just described that the integrated transport strategy is wanting to address and look at, because it's so frustrating for people to see half a cycle lane and then you're chucked onto a dual carriageway or onto a very unsafe stretch of road, and we need to make sure that whatever is delivering those kind of very perverse outcomes at a local level are properly addressed. And part of the reason for that is the stop-start approach. I think the initial direction was set in this first phase of the spending review, where we reversed the cuts of the previous government to active travel and provided £100 million of funding to Active Travel England, who are doing a fantastic job of, and that's really the model that we're building on elsewhere in the department, of Active Travel England going out to local authorities and skilling them up, and they provide capability rankings to local authorities to say what level they are at and able to be able to both write the bids for and then deliver the active travel infrastructure. I think the lessons from COVID was that the money was out the door and they required it to be built too quickly, and it lost the support of local communities in some instances. And it's really important that things are done with local people. Otherwise it can, as we've seen, get into a very messy culture war that can become very unpleasant and toxic. And I was very clear in the summer that we're certainly ending any toxicity or politicisation of this issue, because it's too important that we get it right. But as we look to the second phase of the spending review, we'll hope to again move to those multi-year settlements in order to avoid that stop-start and constant rescoping, which not only delivers poor outcomes but ends up costing the taxpayer more as well.
I think answers to supplementary.
Right, okay, thank you. Now, obviously I was on the committee for quite a few years, but I'm very pleased that my new committee members are also interested in some of the work that was done before. So I'll start with Scott. You have a question.
So, Secretary of State, I'm sure you appreciate that as passenger-in-chief, many of our railway stations are difficult to access, difficult to navigate through, but particularly if you have a disability. So is this something you're giving consideration to?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we set out our plans to establish Great British Railways, one of its 6 key priorities is accessibility, because we're all too conscious that the railways are not working for disabled people at the moment. I'm sure you will all have seen Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson's recent experience, and I met with her on a few occasions since then, and she said, she only tweets very rarely when things go wrong. It goes wrong far more often than she uses her social media platform for. So we know that there are massive issues on the railway. We're working with the rail to improve the Passenger Assist app, which allows you to book a couple of hours in advance before travel. But again, for too many people, even when you've booked it, the assistance isn't there when people turn up, and that's partly because of, again, very, very different working practices across the railways, which we're trying to address. The Rail Minister, through the passage of the Public Ownership Bill, committed for us to publish a rail accessibility roadmap, which we'll do as we look to set up Great British Railways. But that will obviously look at both improvements and investment in infrastructure, but also, as I say, the passenger experience and the staff and the customer service experience that disabled people have on the railways. The other important thing as we set up Great British Railways is we'll be establishing the Passenger Standards Authority, which will be a one-stop shop for complaints. The problem at the moment is people have too many different routes to complain, and therefore nobody takes responsibility and accountability, and that accessibility will be one of the major things that the PSA looks at. Good.
So I think Rebecca's questions are about integrated transport. In terms of accessibility, do you feel that they've got an integrated approach to how people travel?
Yeah, so the key principle of the integrated transport strategy is that we start from people's needs and work back. And we had an internal conversation just last week that said that needs to think about accessibility as first and foremost, because if you've got an accessible transport system, it's inclusive to everyone. So it's on that principle that we're building out the integrated transport strategy. Speaking of Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson, I was really pleased as well last week that she agreed to chair and launch the Aviation Accessibility Task Force. Because again, you may have seen on social media recently Frank Gardner's treatment on a Polish airline, and for too many people they're not flying with dignity. So she's leading that industry task force for us that will look at measures that can be taken on a voluntary basis before we potentially look to legislation in the future.
Okay, good. So I hope as well as passenger-in-chief, you're also pedestrian-in-chief. So London has a pavement parking ban. Edinburgh, I think, one started in January, if memory serves me right. previous government consulted in November 2020 about it. That's when the consultation closed. I recently spoke to Guide Dogs, the charity. They said the number one transport issue people face is pavement parking. You don't have much money, but empowering local authorities to get a pavement parking ban that works right for them wouldn't really cost you that much money. So is it time to act?
I completely recognise how important it is for accessibility, and I'm sure it's come up on doors that you've knocked in your own constituency. It certainly has in mine. We're considering what options we have available, because we want to make sure that any measures are not burdensome on local authorities and are done in the most effective way. But I am really committed to responding to the consultation under, I think it was 2 governments ago, as quickly as possible, and I'll write to the committee in the coming. I'm just looking at my notes, in the coming months as we respond to the consultation.
Okay, good.
Alex.
About 24 places across the country currently have got e-scooter trials. They've now been running for about 4 years, so presumably you've got quite a lot of data from those trials. Given that, how do you think that they're going, and do you plan to introduce legislation regulating the use of e-scooters?
Yeah, we've not got parliamentary time in this session or a relevant bill that could be used to regulate e-scooters, but we will look to legislate. Absolutely, it's clearly required, and again, it's not good enough that it's been left in this situation for too long. We have expressions of interest out at the moment, running for more trials, and there's been a lot of interest because it can be a really effective part of an integrated transport strategy, and it does allow people, again with accessibility needs, to travel easier. But there are undoubtedly issues around parking and around street litter, and I think we need to really carefully analyse what journeys they are replacing and the behavioural impact of e-scooters, and we'll make sure in the second round of trials that we are properly evaluating and considering all that data.
Okay, right. Sorry, I lost my place. Scott again. Yep.
So, hello again, Secretary of State. So it'd be interesting to learn how your road safety strategy is progressing. So I know many cities in the UK, including London, already have a Vision Zero approach where they plan to completely eliminate serious injuries and deaths over some time, and other countries have adopted that. Is this something you'll consider as part of that strategy?
So I met with some road safety campaigners only yesterday. I'm meeting some more this afternoon, which are obviously really emotional meetings, because it's parents that have lost children in road collisions. And we talked about a number of things, but one of the things that they were really keen to impress is that a lot of the discourse around road safety is often around boy racers and around young men and drink and drugs, which are obviously a significant part of road collisions that happen in this country. But there are also lots of other road users, pedestrians, passengers that sadly suffer fatal incidents or are seriously injured. And we need a number of mechanisms to look at the issue in the round. So myself and the Minister for the Future of Roads, Lillian Greenwood, met with a number of stakeholders just a few weeks ago, and we have started the process to set in place the first road safety strategy in this country for over a decade. We're looking really carefully and again taking evidence from other countries where they have Vision Zero and cities in this country to see what's worked and adopt a whole system approach, because this can't just be a Department for Transport owned policy. It needs to be across government, whether it be in education or indeed the criminal justice system, to look at the most effective measures, and we will prioritise those that are most effective, because I really think one death on our roads is too many, and I think we treat road safety in a way as if it is somehow a natural accident. I think if the numbers of people being killed or seriously injured on our roads were happening under any other form of if they've been killed in any other way, we would be treating it as a pandemic, and I think we have normalised it for too long.
Yeah, and I think demand for action is always going to exceed budget, And I think you're right to focus on the fact that these accidents are always avoidable, but it's just a matter of technology and changes. And thank you for mentioning the safe system approach. So recently we had a fatal accident inquiry in Edinburgh, which didn't focus on a younger driver, it focused on an older driver. And the conclusion was that the death at that point was avoidable. And if you don't mind, I'll just read out the one sentence. It said the driver was permitted to keep driving as a result of a serious failure in the present system, which allows drivers with dementia to self-certify fitness to drive. Obviously, that is really concerning. So I'd be interested to know if you're aware of this case from your officers and if you're able to act on it.
Yeah, so the Sheriff Principal from that inquiry has written to me and made a recommendation, which the DVLA are leading on the response. Obviously, there is a requirement when people's medical condition seriously alters to notify the DVLA, but the DVLA are considering how to respond to that inquiry and will be providing advice to me by the 11th of December. So I'll make sure that I update you and the committee more widely when we've received that advice.
Excellent. And more widely, finally, do you plan to set up the Road Safety Investigation Branch?
That is one of the measures that is being considered as part of the road safety strategy.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you. Me again, Secretary of State. The Department's 2024 annual report states that there have been challenging workforce capacity pressures and staff turnover has been significantly higher than 10 years ago. So how do you plan to address these issues facing your department?
That might be one for them.
I think in fairness that probably is one for me and Joe in the first instance. So I think obviously the annual report would have been referring to the year ending April this year, and I think it's fair to say during that year we had seen a number of challenges, which I think is probably what that was referring to. So we were experiencing quite high staff turnover at that point, higher than we've seen historically. We had some industrial relations challenges actually right across the civil service linked to pay in that particular year, which members may recall, and there was sort of negative sentiment amongst our staff on some issues. Cost of living was obviously a huge pressure for our people, as it was for everybody, and we were, dealing with some headcount reductions and other challenges. I think it's fair to say the situation has improved in a number of areas since then. Our turnover has declined from where it was. It's not at that high level anymore. I think the pay situation, obviously we've had a more favourable pay settlement across the civil service, 5% this year, which I think has been very helpful in terms of both resolving industrial action, but also making our staff feel more positive about their work and jobs. So I think things have moved on. I would also say when I talk about the department, I tend to talk about the core department. Our agencies do tend to face specific pressures, DVSA in particular in relation to driving examiner recruitment, which obviously is a very important issue in terms of driving examinations and how quickly they can be provided. But in terms of the core department, I feel we've moved on quite significantly. There are always challenges, and it's a constant thing, and it's my job and Joe's to fix it, to ensure that we are matching our people and our capability to the things that the Secretary of State and government want us to deliver. I don't think that's anything unusual, and you would expect that to be the case. We are doing at the moment a review of our workforce to make sure that we are now fully aligned to the new priorities of this government, but also that we have the skills and the capability that we need. It's not just about how many people we have, it's about whether we've got people with the right sorts of skills to deliver this government's agenda. So I sort of... I wouldn't want to overstate the challenges then. There were some significant points we were dealing with. I feel we're in a more positive place now, but this is just part of the normal challenge of running a large, complex government department and ensuring we're able to deliver for ministers and the public.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is we're really seeing the benefit now of our new offices in Birmingham and Leeds. We're a department that has always had small offices in Swansea and Hastings, but been very London centred. We've now got about a third of the department working outside London, That gives people opportunities to develop their careers, living in places where you don't have to be able to commute to London. It gives us resilience in being able to access different labour markets. And also, just most importantly, it gives us different perspectives. And we were delighted the Secretary of State was working from the Leeds office in the summer.
It's very nice.
Yeah. But it's really helping.
Okay, I think Lawrence, you wanted to come back. We've got we're not out of time, so you wanted to come back on a question earlier.
Thank you. Yes, it was in relation to the question that Ollie had asked about fuel duty and the relative cost of public and private transport. And we have a discussion about this year's decisions, but it has been a long-term trend for that relative gap to widen as a result of central government decisions. With reference to the objectives of achieving modal shift from private to public transport and those environmental objectives, do you think that is sustainable in the long term?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, all decisions around taxation are obviously a matter for the Treasury. I do think, as I said earlier, given the current cost of living pressures, it was the right one. And the vast majority of buses obviously do rely on diesel at the moment, so it would have been a significant pressure on our bus services as well. I think, as we look to the future, the absolute priority is ensuring that we have a public transport system that is world class for every corner of the country. And my ambition is for the rest of England, because we are devolved, is not dimmed. We have a significant settlement in this budget, and I want to see the kind of public transport system that London enjoyed everywhere. And I do think, sorry to keep harping on about Dijon, but it's a very, very small city, only about the size of Chester, and it has a remarkable integrated transport system. It's built tram lines in less than a decade, and that is my level of ambition for every corner of England. And I think we have a government that has an ambition to achieve it, and we have the reform agenda in place in the Department for Transport, and a Chancellor that is backing us as well to deliver it.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing a Dijon level of
Dijon
public
style
transport in Birmingham.
Yeah. Ollie, you wanted to come back on something the Secretary of State's just said.
Yes. Although I'm very pleased to note your enthusiasm for trams. Bordeaux also has a lovely system. 50 miles of it that grew up just in 15, 20 years. Just picking up what you said about Treasury, Secretary of State. Given that Treasury does have such dominant control over so many aspects of policy, including taxation, do you think it's possible to achieve your objectives with the current level of Treasury control?
Well, the Treasury certainly doesn't control the department's policies, but we are absolutely aligned in our ambition and in our strategic priorities. The manifesto that we have just stood on was obviously agreed fully across government, and I think because the Cabinet worked together as a team for so long in opposition, it does mean that we are an extraordinarily aligned team, and we work very well and collectively together. So that's why I was delighted that the Chancellor backed our priorities so ambitiously with the budget settlement that she did this year.
Okay, thank you. Baggy,
just
maybe a related question.
I was reading something, I think it was at the weekend, about unfair prosecutions over fare evasion. Could you just tell us what we're doing about that?
Yeah, so I'm really pleased today to announce that the Office for Rail and Road is going to be conducting a review into this. You'll have seen, there were more stories over the weekend, and I think there's more in the press this morning about people who've made genuine mistakes with their tickets, because frankly the fares and ticketing system is so grossly complex and overcomplicated, and that is feeding into our wider reforms about fares and ticketing. But there was a particular example a few weeks ago of a young man who hadn't realised that his young person's rail card wasn't viable before 10 a.m, which I didn't know, and I'm the Secretary of State. So I think he'd paid £1.50 less for his ticket than he should have, and he ended up being prosecuted, which I think we can all agree should have elicited a slightly more generous response. Revenue protection officers do a really, really hard job in very difficult circumstances. I'm sure we've all been on trains that have been rowdy, and fare evasion is unfortunately commonplace. So we're not backing away from tackling genuine fare evasion and the tiny minority of passengers that do get aggressive or even violent with revenue protection officers. But what we do need to do is look across the piece and make sure that terms and conditions are simple enough and properly understood and properly communicated, so that we avoid people making genuine mistakes, and we have a system in place that allows people to pay the difference if they had made that genuine mistake. And that's what the Office of Rail and Road is launching a review in today, to make sure that we've got the correct policies and communications in place.
Good. Okay. Scott, you indicated.
Yeah, thank you. So Ollie's question was really good about, funding, because so much of what we want to do is really, really expensive, but it's absolutely fundamental to getting our economy back on track. So it's kind of pay to win, if you like. But nonetheless, funding is a constraint. But if funding was no option in that world, but how much of a constraint is the planning process at all levels, and the bureaucracy we'll have to get through to deliver a project? I mean, even a simple thing like a bus lane can take a couple of years to go through the approval process. So forget about funding. How much of a constraint is the planning process for what we want to do?
I think the planning process, but also some of the bureaucracy that has to go through from consents for me. So we're looking at that through the English Devolution Bill, of where I can give up some of my operational meddling from over requests from local authorities to make things much more streamlined. Because, as I've said previously, it can't be up to me, or with the greatest respect, officials in Whitehall, to decide, what speed limits or what road safety measures should be in place on local roads. Clearly, local leaders and local elected politicians, in consultation with their communities, know that far better than we do. So removing some of that bureaucracy is really important. But I don't think we can underestimate how important these planning reforms will be. They will vastly reduce cost and reduce the time it takes to do infrastructure improvements of all scales.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's been such a priority for the Deputy Prime Minister in taking that forward.
Good.
And on that twin issue of funding and planning, to what extent are you working with Cabinet colleagues on ways of funding new infrastructure that other countries use as a matter of course, such as land value capture in growth areas?
So I think there's a number of opportunities to explore land value capture, both across Cabinet but also at a local level, and our mayoral colleagues are really keen on exploring opportunities for it. We've been in discussions with Greater Manchester and Liverpool about opportunities there, but also future both large-scale station infrastructure and mass transit opportunities through land value capture in places like Cambridge, for example, in the expansion programmes there, and then working with Treasury colleagues very closely on potential private financing options for, be it Euston or other rail infrastructure across the country.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering all our questions. But I'm going to take Chair's prerogative, because I've got one sort of overarching question. We've covered quite a lot of work that we've covered the work you're doing pretty extensively, particularly short-term objectives, things you actually want to see happen in the next year or two to get things moving. In 5 years' time, at the end of this Parliament, what do you see as being different in the UK transport system than from now?
Well, I want to see more people on the bus and our railways running on time, 5 million potholes filled in, and everyone with the ability to create Dijon-style transport networks.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To you for coming and answering our questions. Thank you to the committee members, and we will meet again as per notices. Order.